Welcome back to The Meaning of Men, the show dedicated to helping men find meaning, purpose, and resilience in their lives. I'm your host, Simeon Atkins, and today we're exploring why having fun is far more important than we think. I'm joined by behavioural scientist and author of The Fun Habit, Mike Rucker, to unpack the surprising science behind fun and how it impacts our well-being, productivity, and even our sense of identity. We delve into the difference between passive and active fun, why fun is often deprioritised in adulthood, and how intentional fun habits can increase mental resilience, reduce burnout, and strengthen our emotional connections with partners, kids, and friends. Mike also offers practical strategies for making fun a deliberate, repeatable habit, even with the busiest schedules. Let's get into it. Michael, if you had to summarise what it is you do and why you do it, what would you say?
Here, looked at this construct of are we just enjoying our time? Are we to juxtapose sort of this longitudinal idea person. I think the zeitgeist in so many books overly thinking we basically we're becoming that's not just an statement there's a rich that's just is true. So if we want to be happy and the tools that are out there are making us unhappy, what this journey to figure out what would at least joyful.
I want to get into the heads of people that are listening and maybe play a bit of devil's advocate and maybe say that a lot of them listening might be thinking that this idea of having fun is something for their kids or someone with a lot more time than they have. Something that I heard you say in another interview that really stood out to me, and I think will probably stand out to a lot of people, is that you were proposing that fun should be prioritized in the same way and thought about in the same way as something like sleep, in terms of the importance for your mind and your body. And I think like sleep, which obviously until recently was seen as this thing that we should be almost wearing it like a badge of honor if you could just work through the night and just work for 3 days straight and not sleep. And obviously the mindset is starting to shift around sleep. And I almost feel like in this productivity focused world and hustle culture, there is this, particularly with something like fun, is definitely something that's put to one side and deprioritized and not really thought of a lot. And I think what's going to be really interesting in this conversation is putting a scientific lens over it and actually showing that people can be more productive and live more happy, fulfilling lives by thinking about fun and actually being more deliberate around how they see fun and how they integrate it into their everyday lives. Before we dive too much down into that rabbit hole, you were talking about the journey that you've been on. I'd love you to tell us a little bit more about that journey that's led you to where you are today.
So for me, it was I think part and parcel as we start to look at this, big component of it is time offline. And so anyone that's been introduced to this idea that time is finite, we tend to think in that as a construct as also a resource, right? I just had an amazing conversation with Ep1, who wrote the Types of Wealth.
Yeah.
And so, luckily his wasn't as traumatic as one of his friends reminded him he only had finite once a year. And for me, my journey with the loss of my brother, like, oh my goodness, my younger brother is now gone. He won't be able to have any further journey. And by the way, I have been giving away all of my time for work. If I look about, I made memories with my kids. There aren't a ton of things that I've done that weren't self-serving, that weren't essentially status games. I haven't enjoyed a ton of time. I've always been chasing that next carrot. And so intimately understanding that time was a finite resource was this big light bulb. And how that connects to happiness, right? Is that we're kind of designing for happiness, taking anything off the table for ourselves and enjoying the journey, then we might get to a place where that's too late, right? I mean, commonly cited work is the work of Bronnie Ware, where she did all of these interviews with folks about the regrets they had, when they were close to passing. And all of them have to do with, living a life for someone else. And so, especially in Western society where we're, the social normative behavior, the underpinning is meritocracy, we're always just trying to level up, right? But then we don't think about, wow, I'm really not enjoying myself. And so you had asked to kind of, pair that with the geeky side, the research side. You have that. And so we know, like, the very basic construct of something like a cognitive behavioral therapy is because folks realize they're living a joyless life, right? And so you start to begin like, okay, what are the things that will at least get you excited about waking up? And so figuring out what that is, whether you want to call it joy or fun, becomes extremely important. Not just because, most of us, if you do, ask, quite frankly, do you want to enjoy what you're doing? We'll say yes, right? It would be a very strange person to say, no, I want to hate the days that I live. But we also know, and you gave, a tip of the hat to it, that it is important to, for playing the long game. And that's the importance of the work that I've done, is that, yes, what we've learned about sleep deprivation with this sort of steal from Peter to pay Paul, the folks that were grinding it out and not getting sleep ultimately would fall down. So we know what it's like to be sleep deprived, but we're not really talking about what it's like to be fun deprived. Yet we see record levels of burnout across all vocations, right? So the scientific principle here is called the hedonic flexibility principle. And what we know is that as you live a joyless life, slowly but surely, you start to lose productivity and you find yourself in this downward spiral, right? If you're not enjoying what you're doing, if you don't have a transition ritual between work and personal life so that you are benefiting from your relationship, so you're not in a state of loneliness. So you do feel connected to the folks that you love. So you're not living through the lens of I have to do, like I have to do this for my kids because I'm a dad. I have to do this, for my wife because I'm a husband, and I get to do, this, arena of gratitude. Like I'm so grateful that I get to serve my wife because she's so loving and she gives back to me. I'm so grateful that I get to serve my kids because they are this beacon of joy in my life and they allow me to live a life of purpose. When you fall out of that frame, right, because everything is just a grind and like, okay, I got to get home because I got to take my kid to baseball and all of this thing, you just feel like you're giving it all away. Ultimately, you fall down. But it's insidious. It's a much slower burn than sleep deprivation, right? And so getting in front of that, understanding the mechanics and figuring out through subtle shifts, how can I do it so that these things are actually enjoyable? So I lean into them rather than feel that these are burdens that life has kind of given me that I just have to do them, becomes extremely important, not just, for your own happiness, but also so that you can play the long game.
I've been doing quite a lot of reflection recently. I'm in my mid-30s now, and I've been looking back at the things when I was in my early 20s that I perceived would make me happy. And it was the classic things like a really well-paying job, nice house, big family, nice car, all of these kind of things. And I was definitely in the mindset of, once I reach this end goal, then I will be happy. And so I've kind of just got to white knuckle it. I've just got to do what I need to do, grind it out, get to that place. And it's interesting because where I am in my life now, I'm very lucky that I've got a lot of those things. And yet I'm still thinking about the next things that I want to strive for. And I think what's become very clear to me is that there isn't this utopian state where I'm going to reach this one thing and then everything's going to be fine. There's always going to be something that I can think about progressing onto and moving on to, there's always going to be a better job, a bigger car, whatever it might be. And so this, as you were saying there, this idea of just trying to enjoy the journey more and not just try to white knuckle everything and just bulldoze my way through life to get to this end state. And I think this is where thinking about something like fun and fun habits, which we're going to dive into in a second, is so important, because they are the building blocks to help you start to enjoy that journey.
Yeah, that is half the battle, right? Is figuring out what the goalpost is for you and then designing against it. The problem is that we often get trapped into status games, right? Like once you level up, there's a whole new arena of things that you might potentially want, but yet those are being prescribed to you. Those aren't your thing, right? And so what is enough becomes a very important question. In fact, I have it scribbled up on my whiteboard right now because I think I had kind of succumbed to, this grandiose nature of a certain level of success. And so thinking about that, like what is important to me to, whatever that is, right? I hate to say my own things because then people kind of latch on. I mean, the work to be done is what are those things for you? And then you can create mechanisms to find your way there. But without that, then it just becomes paddling in the ocean. And that can be extremely, extremely tiresome, right? I mean, you're essentially moving all this energy, but not propelling yourself forward. And that is the essence of burnout, right? Is essentially just burning it at both ends, but not really knowing where you're going. So figuring out what is enough for you is part of the battle. But then also showing yourself some grace. I really do believe in this second mountain ideology, and that is when we're young, we don't know what our identity is. Part of the fun, quite frankly, I look back at my 20s, I did not know who I was, and I didn't have the information to develop who I was. So I tried on a lot of different hats. I mean, you could almost look back at that time and call me a poser because that fits. I was posing in these different identities to figure out which one fit for me. And some I look back, whoa, because I was so not that person, but I needed to try on that hat just to figure it out. And then also, we don't know how we're going to make money, right? Or what money means to us. So it's trying a few different occupations becomes important, especially for folks that maybe because of social pressures or familial pressures get into a profession that they really shouldn't be in, right? Like I never wanted to be a physician or I never wanted to be a lawyer. That's sort of what my father or mother pushed me into. And then they're miserable, right? These are folks that make really poor decisions. And then you have the added burden of social contagion. Then their kids are generally miserable too, right? Because they pass that on. They're not happy and they know they're leading their children, through the same social fabric to a life that's probably unhappy. So there's this layer of guilt, and yet that's the only playbook they've been given because they didn't experiment, as they were young.
Yeah, and the book The Second Mountain, actually, I've just finished, and it really resonated with me. I feel like I'm kind of in that valley. So they talk about the first mountain, having this idea of what's going to make you happy, essentially, and striving for that, and then maybe getting to a stage in your life where you're realizing that's maybe not the right path, coming into this valley of realization, and the second mountain is almost your next calling. And I think that you are right, you can fall into the trap of looking back at that with some element of regret, but you're right, you need to really go through that process, I think, to start to get a better understanding of yourself.
Yeah, good exercise too for anyone. And the neat thing is, I've talked to some other folks, and we've all sort of built them in different ways. Mine is essentially, how would you write your obituary? And a friend of mine, Jay from The One Thing, was like, that's really morbid. And so he was like, I have this exercise where you just look 10 years in the future, try to figure out who you want to be then you can work backwards. But whatever works for you, as trite as, begin with the end in mind is, it is important because without that, right, the branches that you have out into the future, if you're not working backwards, can be so overwhelming because there are 100 different things you could do, right? And so, but by picking one, then you're sort of pruning that ambiguity, which is oftentimes what leads so many of us to angst, right? Because they're like, well, there are 50 different things I should be doing. That's not humanly possible, right? So part of the work is figuring out what you're going to say no to, or reframed, right? What are you going to say yes to, so you know what you're going to say no.
What is a fun habit? So you've written the book, The Fun Habit. What fundamentally is a fun habit, and what inspired you to take that direction with the book?
So a habit is just this sort of cue to the reader that it should be habitual, right?
Hmm.
And so many of us are living fun-starved lives, right? There's a deprivation of fun in our lives. So how do we habitually put that back? So that's the tip of the hat to habit. And then it's just really understanding how are you spending your time. I think most of the folks that do this type of work have you look at your habitual life and figure out what are the things that actually light you up and bring you energy, and what are the things that deplete you. And oftentimes folks are surprised by how much of their time in any 168 hours is, and that's the amount of hours we have in a week, are things that they kind of just did on autopilot or don't want to do, or through one or two simple decisions could change their circumstance. And that becomes important, right? Because whenever we look at, let's just, call it a system, because, that's essentially what time management is, right? We tend to be accretive. It's really hard to take things out. We always feel like, we need to do that next thing. Like, what's this piece of advice and how can I overlay it into my life? We often don't create the space in our lives that we need to allow these things to thrive. And so the first step is to figure out what are the things that I don't want to do. So you create that space so that you can then add, things back in. But what I think my work kind of adds value is it's not just the things that you don't want to do. Oftentimes, it's also the things that pacify you, right? And so I have this thing called the play model, and I'm going to give a quick geeky science lesson and then I'll move on. I'm really trying my best as of late to make things really accessible. But within the context of my work, it's important to understand the psychological term called valence, right? And so it's just a fancy word of, do the things that I do bring me pleasure? Am I drawn to them, or are they not fun? Do they, are they unpleasurable? And if I didn't have to do them, would I not do them, right? And so why that's important is, of course, we want to do things that have a high level of valence, right? We enjoy time with our friends. We enjoy time doing the things that we like. And that could be work, right? Or it could be in service. But those things that we're drawn to, we tend to do more and we want to do them. Thing is, if we're in a negative valence state because the crux of our day just isn't enjoyable, what we found is that once we get home and it's time for leisure, instead of doing something that fills us up, we tend to just want to displace that negative valence. So we do things like social media, we do things like plop down on a couch and not necessarily a show that we and our loved ones and our family look forward to and will all enjoy. And if I ask you what you watched a week from now, you tell me with great pleasure, like, oh yeah, did you see Severance, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, I don't know, I was channel surfing. Things where our brains know it's so unimportant we don't encode in memory. Those things that escape us from that negative valence state trick us into thinking they're somewhat enjoyable when they're not at all. They're just a form of escapism to get us out of that terrible day that we had. And the problem, again, going back to what we talked about at the beginning, is that gets us in a downward spiral to the point we don't want to do anything anymore, right? We just want to always sort of escape negative valence. And so figuring out how to replace those, what in psychology we call passive leisure, with things that actively light us up, become extremely important. But that shift is difficult because, again, being lazy is, pretty easy to do, where shifting towards active leisure, even though we know in the long run gives us energy, that shift becomes hard, like any addiction, right? I mean, behavior change is difficult because we like our habituated lives. They're comfortable.
I want to pick up on what you said there around intentional fun versus passive fun, because I think that sometimes we might have this idea that fun things are something that might happen to us, like as the consequence of something else that's going on, rather than something that we can actually consciously think about and, as you were saying there, build habits around. And I think that's really important to note and just think about how you can start to build that into your arsenal day in, day out, and start to be more deliberate and more intentional with what you're doing around fun.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things to unpack there, right? So from the behavioral science standpoint, we know that, anyone that's familiar with BJ Fogg's model, and if you're not, just know that when you're more motivated, you're going to do the thing, right? And so if there are behaviors or habits that you'd like to incorporate, spending more time with your children, for instance, and, this focus towards fathers, if it's going to the gym, getting healthy, whatever it is, figuring out first, not necessarily the time components or how you want to, put it into your schedule, but how can I create it so that it's something that I actually want to do so that you're more motivated to actually do the thing. And we know that that is the number one predictor, at least within the first 6 months of a habit, of actually sustaining that habit. But we never talk about it because, again, you sort of alluded at the beginning, we villainize this idea of fun, right? Like, if it's meant to be good for me, I can't enjoy it, right? I mean, how dare I, right? No pain, no gain. And yet we know it's the number one lever for actually doing the thing. And so just that invitation to go, okay, you know what? Playing Monopoly with my child is like watching paint dry because that game lasts 3 hours. But yet I still want to play games with my kid. What could I do? Right. And for me personally, we ended up my birthday was recently and we got a PS5 because I loved playing basketball. I remember that as a youth. I hadn't played video games for a while. But now instead of playing Monopoly with my kid all the time, now we're playing NBA games, and which is a lot more enjoyable for both of us. We remember that, right? Because we both love basketball. That time is well spent. And again, I like that example because it's not villainizing television or, these things that sometimes get villainized because it's not passive, right? It's a date that we have. We both enjoy it. It's something that I get to do with him. It's not I have to go play Monopoly because I want it. It's an obligation of me to spend time with my kids. It's no, I get to do this fun thing. And as trite as that is, it blows me away how many dads don't do that, right? Don't co-create these experiences with their child that they want to do more of. Instead, they're like, well, this is the dad's duty. We've got to do X, Y, and Z. Like, no, you have the agency and autonomy to design this. And it doesn't even have to be something that feels selfish. It can be a selfless act. It's just you have the ability to co-create it. Like if they don't want to do the thing that you want to do, then maybe you don't do that thing either. But you can, it is this thing that you have some control of. Does that make sense?
Perfect sense. And I think that we've done a good job in covering what fun is and how we can start to build a habit. What I want to move on to now is what impact fun can fundamentally have on us. Because I think we're probably still in this stage where we're thinking fun sounds good for us. I like the idea of it, but what difference is this actually going to make to me? So I'd be curious to know from the research that you've done, what does the neuroscience maybe tell us about the impact that fun has on our brains, for example?
So what we've learned about dopamine is that it's actually a neurochemical that gets elicited when we anticipate something that's going to be either exciting or enjoyable. So when we stack the deck in our favor by making the things that we already want to do more enjoyable, again, we're lured to do them, right? That's one benefit. The other is when we do enjoy them, when we feel that they're important or we flex our curiosity, so we're actually, they become a learning element too, then we create new neural pathways in our brain because we need to encode that information. And so what we find is folks that are living a fun life instead of a habituated life actually are able to create an immense amount of neural plasticity because they're storing all this new memories in their brain. And so I stole this from a neuroscientist because I was pretty clunky about explaining it, but he explained it in a very eloquent way. If we had 100 copies of the same book, would we keep all 100 copies in our office? Or would we remove 99 and just store that memory that, oh, I had 100 copies of that book at one time, right? Versus having 100 different books that we all enjoyed, where we would certainly keep those 100 books. Well, that's what happens when we live these habituated lives, right? Where it's rinse and repeat. Take the kids to practice, get food from the same place, just our life is stuck on routine, we look back at that and go, oh yeah, I spent the last year doing the same thing. It's stored as one neural node versus, the families that are able to create this big tapestry of different things. And it might not necessarily all be fun, right? It's just really creating novel things, which then serendipitously do invite most of the time, more enjoyment into your life. Now you're remembering this rich life that you lived the last year. Like, oh yeah, we did this. And oh my gosh, we did this. And then you remember we hung out with John. Oh my gosh, that was such a great Sunday. So not only are we creating neural plasticity, so that's the physiological benefit. From a psychological benefit, we dilate time, right? So if you think again about back to that book analogy, if you have sort of one node on your timeline, right? Well, as you look back at the perception of time in your life, it's very short, right? Well, we did this thing, you know. Um, but if you created this tapestry and created all these neural nodes, so that when you look back at your life, memory, 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 right? Now you've dilated time and you look back with, just all of this sort of love and gratitude for what you did. And we know that builds a huge amount of resilience to go forward because you're going to have very limited regrets that way.
I interviewed the author of The Humor Habit, Paul Onsicup, recently, and
Yeah, great
he
guy,
was
by the way.
yeah, it was a fabulous interview, and he was talking about the fact that humor can be used in the same way as something like meditation or yoga to help regulate how you're feeling, help to de-stress or help reduce burnout. And it was really interesting because I hadn't thought about something like that with humor, where you could use it so tactically like that. And what you're saying there is, obviously fun is closely linked to something like humor. And I think that fun habits can be used in the same way. If you think about it like something like yoga, meditation, something else that you would do, it's just like another tool in your armory there to help with regulating how you're feeling long term.
Yeah, and I think, I've created a huge tent by essentially saying fun. And I think humor is essentially one of the areas in that big tent. I know I'm more intimately familiar with the research on laughter, but I find it fascinating that something like laughter yoga, where you're not necessarily triggered by humor, but you're actually just engaging in that physiological act of laughter, has almost the same benefit as if you were laughing at something that was funny. But we know it downregulates the nervous system, right? And then that has a cascade of interesting things depending on which researcher you believe, all the way to strengthening the immune system. Certainly, is a nice release for the stress of the day, et cetera, et cetera. It sounds like you've already covered that area, but I think an important piece here too is that you get to decide what is fun for you, right? And
Mm.
so you have all of these things, and oftentimes what we fall victim to is we'll just pick a few things that have worked for others, and then we'll get frustrated that it didn't work for you. The big one that I highlight in the book, because I think it's widely overprescribed, is gratitude journaling, right? We actually know that gratitude for most of us is helpful, but giving someone who's already feeling busy or maybe is in a chapter of their life where there's not a ton to be grateful for, the mandate to find 3 things a day to be grateful for actually sends them in the wrong direction, right? So this idea that one thing that you hear is going to be the end all for you is such an asinine sort of idea. And yet, all of us want that bite-sized wisdom, right? And then, and that, why isn't this working for me? The most insidious part of that is it will bleed into your identity. In fact, that's, what I unpack in the book about happiness. Once you get, let's say you tried 3 different things and for whatever reason, just bad luck, those 3 things weren't never meant for you, right?
Mm.
Then you go, okay, well, those didn't work and they're working for other folks. I must be an unhappy person. And the problem is, once you get to that point, once it starts to seep into your identity, we all look for bias artifacts to support that, because identity is one of the strongest components of the human experience. And so if your identity is maladaptive, right, because you didn't take control of it, then those things can be really harmful, right? These things that aren't working in our. So my invitation to you is figure out first again, kind of going back to that end in mind, like what are the things that I would want to do first, then go seek those tools out in that area, right? If you hate humor, or comedy is not your thing, is a better way to put that, then my suggestion to go to comedy clubs, like just throw that in the trash. Like would never work for you because you don't like comedy in the first place.
Yeah, there's a similar conversation I was having recently about therapy, actually. You might try one or two different types of therapy and it doesn't work for you for whatever reason, then you decide that therapy is not for you. And you might just be unlucky. It might have even been the right type of therapy for you, but actually just had the wrong therapist. And so it's as you were saying there, trying to maybe understand what's going to be impactful for you rather than just having this blanket approach that no therapy, for example, is worthy for you. I want to move on shortly to talking directly to people that are thinking, well, this all sounds great, but I just don't have time for fun. I'm too busy. I'm looking at my calendar. There's no openings in the day for me to start incorporating those fun habits. I definitely want to come on to that later. Before we go on to that, though, I want to talk specifically about men and what impact this can have on men. And one of the things I was thinking of before we came on to talk today was environments where I've been with my friends and we've been doing something really fun and really enjoyable. I think is a really good gateway to lowering walls and barriers and actually facilitating really healthy conversations. I think sometimes when it becomes a little bit too serious and a little bit too forced, it's really difficult to have those kind of conversations where when you're doing something that's a little bit lighthearted and a little bit fun, I can actually think of lots of times where that's just organically allowed for these kind of conversations to happen. Is that something that you found in your research? And I'd love to hear any more examples you might have of that.
Yeah, so it absolutely is the glue that helps us develop friendships, right? And so one of the basic tenets of being able to disclose that type of information and opening up to people is shared experiences. And so using fun as a vehicle, because again, fun lures us into doing something, right, is an amazing way to start to begin to develop these friendships. Here in North Carolina, where I live, we've done this through a giving circle, right? And so we create these events that people actually want to go to. It has a level of service, so we all feel good about it as well, right? So there's that added level. But now, because we've been doing it for a couple of years, a bunch of the guys are able to actually share things outside of this activity that we put together and develop real friendship. And so I think one of the inconvenient truths is that it does take time, right? Like you're not going to disclose something to someone that you just met. And so there's no time like the present to figure out what that is for you. But to answer your question discreetly, what happens when you know what fun is for you and being able to find an affinity group that has a affinity for that same thing, then you already have a shared language, right? And so you can fast track those experiences by sharing things that you've already done. Let's say it's mountain climbing or cycling or jujitsu. You can share your experiences with that individual. And so you're able to backfill a shared history by just being able to share these experiences rather than doing them together. And so that can be an added benefit of figuring out what is it enjoyable that I want to do and how can I find my tribe. Because again, with that shared language, you can kind of accelerate that familiarity, which is required, quite frankly, to be able to start to then disclose with one another. And then the quickest way to do that, again, is if that group is specific for the challenge that you're trying to unpack. But as we know, oftentimes men don't like to invite themselves into that circle because that does require kind of a immediate level of intimacy that a lot of men, aren't willing to go to. I do, and I fall into that camp, quite frankly. I want to trust the folks, because I've fallen victim to oversharing where you sort of overwhelm, right? And I think for me in particular, I have a level of ADHD where if I do feel this connection with someone, then I'll immediately kind of overwhelm them. And so both have those risks, right? And so you really do need a level of familiarity to feel that shared reciprocity of comfort. And so fun can be a great way to develop that. One, I mean, this is just like if someone's like, okay, give me another example. Hiking clubs seem to be really, really great because they cater to both extroverts and introverts. because in hiking, right, you're naturally out in nature, which is sort of inviting already. You're generally in sunlight, which is really healthy. But extroverts can cohort together in groups and talk, and introverts can bounce in and out. Like if they don't want to be overwhelmed, they can develop, sort of relationships of one. And then when they just need to, okay, I've given what I want to give, I've listened, and I've taken what I want to take. Now I'm going to go walk by myself again. Anyways, that one seems to always be successful. So I like giving it up as an example.
Yeah, it's this idea of shoulder to shoulder as well, which just comes up in so many conversations I have with men specifically, and where they feel open and happy to be having these conversations as opposed to being sat face to face, staring to someone's eyes. Actually, just kind of walking alongside someone doing some kind of activity seems to be more of a facilitating way to open up these conversations. The other thing I was thinking as you were talking there, specifically around fun and doing a fun activity, is I think it's a great way to create a safe space. And I think, again, men need to feel like they're in a safe space before they feel comfortable to open up. And I feel if people are around you being a little bit silly, having a laugh, having a bit of a joke, I can see how that would facilitate an environment where everyone's feeling a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more relaxed, feeling a little bit more safe, and therefore those conversations can flow a little bit more easily.
Yeah.
And what about with romantic relationships? So with our partners, how can creating fun habits maybe help to enrich those kind of relationships?
So this one, I'm in a sex book, right? And sorry if I'm referencing it a second time, but the conversation with Sahil was a good one, and he reminded me of the Netflix CEO. So here's a guy, again, you're talking about so many of us men complaining we have no time. Here's someone that built one of the most amazing companies in the world, quite frankly, and still made time to have a date night with his wife every Tuesday. So in the spirit of the fun habit, right? What is the habit that you're creating with your partner so that you're not giving it all away to your kid, right? And so what I found is that child one, child two, whatever, you get into this rhythm where, quite frankly and rightfully, you're giving it all away to the child because they need that in those early years. But then you forget that you also need this connection to one another. So, episodically sort of giving that away might be what's needed. I still think you should try, to do it throughout. But again, just figuring out co-creating these experiences that you like 1 hour out of the 168, right? To begin with, and just going and enjoying each other's company. But if, as trite as that sounds, you talk to so many men that are like, oh yeah, I can't tell you the last time we went on a date. I mean, isn't that weird? Here's the person that you love, you're raising kids with, right? And even if you are entrepreneurially minded, look at it as a meeting. You haven't had one meeting with the head of a household, because we can kid ourselves that we're the head of households, but you look at every discernible data, women run the house, right? And you haven't had one meeting with them. And so, that may or may not work. It wouldn't work for me. I quite frankly love my wife and, want to make sure that I at least have 2 or 3 hours with her. But the fact that so many of us don't, right? And just that invitation to get it on the calendar. And, often a piece of wisdom that I convey is we do need to schedule those things in our busy lives. If we say yeah, we'll get around to that, we just don't. But if it's on our calendar, we tend not to do it, right? We just tend to talk about it and romanticize it and fantasize about it. Get it on the calendar. If you like movies, buy that movie ticket. If you like comedy like myself, buy that comedy thing. If it's just a dinner, even if you're not a person of means and you can't afford a fancy dinner, book a reservation at your local fish and chips or whatever it is, but just get it on the calendar and then it will happen. And then you'll realize how amazing it was and you'll want to do it again. And then hopefully you do make it a habit. And so going back to the sleep analogy, because another thing I find is like, oh, great, this guy wants to layer all this stuff on. I'm already so busy. Just like sleep, where we needed to get from 4 hours a night to 8 hours. With fun, it's just how do we get you to 2 to 5 hours, right? We just want to make sure that you're checking in with your wife 2 or 3 times a week. So don't use well, I don't know, we're just too busy as an excuse. You're not. Again, it's 1 hour out of 168.
just have this image of, as you were talking about there, schedule meetings with the head of the household. I just had this image of me setting up a weekly one-to-one with my wife and just seeing how she'd react to that. just putting some notes in of an agenda that we're going to cover.
Well, and that's what, some other people prescribe that. I don't, because my wife and I are pretty good at communicating. We have a system of emails and SMS, but some folks where they really have delineated all of their lives separately, I don't think they realize the corrosion that can happen there. So, other folks that know this area better, right, do suggest, coming with an agenda so that in a very safe space before it builds up and becomes an explosion, you are discussing these topics. So I'm fortunate that we have release valves, built into our family system. But for someone who really has bifurcated, right, one person takes the budget and the other person kind of takes other domestic duties. Like if you're not communicating to those, having a weekly meeting isn't a bad idea, and again, something that's recommended by a lot of marriage and family therapists.
Okay, so I think we've done a really good job of defining what fun is and what a fun habit is. I think we've done a good job of highlighting the benefits of fun. I now want to speak directly to those people that are still saying, well, I just don't have time. I'm just so busy. My job won't allow it. Then I've got to go home to a busy family household. Then I've got to make time for the gym and other things. So if we're talking to those people specifically, what advice would you give them to start to build in some fun habits in their schedule? You started to allude to it there a little bit about looking at how we could go from a couple of hours a week to 5-6 hours a week in the same way that we're looking at sleep. What advice would you give in terms of building that into your routines?
Yeah, so there's a few things there. One, call yourself out for lying, because when you look at time use data, even really busy folks that are truly working like 65 hours a week generally overestimate the amount that they're doing. So go look at the health meter on your phone, see how much you're in Gmail, Slack, and social channels, and then realize that you likely could pare those down a little bit and integrate some of the things that we've discussed into your calendar. The next thing is, just pick 15 minutes. Like start slow. Remember what it's like to have agency and autonomy over your life. Pick 15 minutes of something that's going to bring a micro joy into your life and realize what that feels like, right? Just remember what it's like to live your life mindfully. And then if you want to go really down the rabbit hole, study the hedonic flexibility principle. Know that the paradox here is the ones that are enjoying their lives, that have transition rituals from work life to leisure life, are ironically the most productive. They're the ones that are crushing life, right? And the folks that are burning at both ends, thinking that that's allowing them the ability to squeeze out a little bit more productivity, might in the short term, but in the long term, always lose the long game. And so if you really are someone that's so A-type that you're like, well, I want to make sure that I'm also always accomplishing my goals, no, injecting fun into some of the things that you do is an important piece of actually living a productive life. And then the great consequence of that is that you actually start enjoying your life more. And that has a cumulative effect. So through social contagion, the folks that you love will be enjoying their lives more as well.
Yeah, in the book you talk about activity bundling, which I think is really relevant to those people, maybe like entrepreneurs, for example, that are just super, super busy and it's just so difficult to squeeze any more hours out of the day or out of the week. And I think what you're saying around activity bundling is making the activities that you are doing more enjoyable, finding ways of making those more enjoyable, and then obviously then the fun habits start to seep in that way.
Yeah, and then you start to understand what it is that you do enjoy doing and what are the things that you don't want to do. And so, again, it doesn't need to be a prescription by someone else's design. You figure it out. Like, that's why I've stopped giving lists, right? Or, like, for the most part, like, here are things that you could do. You figure it out. What is enjoyable to you? Honestly, look at the things that you don't want to be doing and how can you turn down the levers on that and amplify the things that you do want to do. But I do think an important prescription is figuring out, if you're stuck in the I have to do mindset, how can we get you to I get to do mindset? And that's where fun really can be helpful, right? Because, yeah, maybe I do have to do this work, but how do I get to do it in a way whether that's in an environment that I like or people that I enjoy or the way I approach that work so that I want to do it the next day. I wake up excited to do it because it is fun and enjoyable. It does have that positive balance. It's not something that's rubbing me down and that if I ask you on a Sunday, how was your week? You're like, it was fucking hell. I did a bunch of shit that wasn't fun.
And as we've been talking as well, I've been thinking about, we've mentioned the word happiness, and it's something I've been speaking about a lot, this idea of happiness versus fulfillment. And I feel like happiness generally is very, very fleeting, and we're always kind of chasing happiness. And fulfillment is, for me, it's more of that kind of like a nourishing meal, for example, like it fills you up for longer, sustains you for longer. And I just feel like talking with you, building fun habits into your life is a way of not just being more happy in the moment, but actually just living a more fulfilled life as well, and just being able to just sustain that for longer.
Yeah, I mean, the two are adjacent, right? But I've been fascinated and I've never unpacked this, so I thought it'd be fun to do it on your podcast. But in the book, I latched on to Dan Gilbert's research for the parenting chapter, and a lot of folks are familiar with it because he's talked about it quite a bit. This idea that when you look at it from a quantitative standpoint, there is an argument to be made that parenthood makes you less happy than if you didn't have kids, right? But that's because as researchers, it requires us to latch on to a definition of what all these words mean, right? And so for me, in the context of my work for fun, the way these studies are done is you carry around a pager, right? And at any given time, I'm going to ask you, how are you feeling and what are you doing, right? And so, yeah, a lot of parental duties, because we're stuck in this I have to do mindset, show up in these research papers as not enjoyable, right? And so you collect these in mass, and it's like, oh, wow, someone without kids is always doing this fun stuff. And someone with kids, has all these dutiful things they need to do. I finally took a 50,000-foot view and I was like, wait, but we can reframe a lot of that stuff as more enjoyable. Not only that, but research outside of social psychology suggests that there are all of these benefits of having kids. We definitely live with more purpose. We have a support system when we get older that will take care of us. We tend to be a lot more content than the folks that look back and go, what if, right? And so this idea that kids do make us less happy, I think is a little maladaptive. But my way to fix that research, that's probably a little bit askew, is how do we make those things that you're doing to support your household more enjoyable for you? And that's part and parcel, for everything that we discussed today. Because once you do that, if happiness is the end state, right, then we are indexing all these things that are a little bit more joyful because we've made them joyful by deliberate design. And that's the ultimate message, right?
I think that's a great point. And I'd actually been thinking about parenthood recently, and there are things that you do day in, day out that might not necessarily make you happy in the moment. If you've got to drag your kids up kicking and screaming to go to school because they don't want to, and that's fun because you're half asleep as well. But actually, the fulfillment that I get as a parent, it's almost that delayed gratification, I suppose. You have to go through some of these things, but overall, I feel happy and fulfilled because of the fact that I'm a father and I find a lot of purpose in that. But I think what you're saying there is almost taking that to the next level. And it's like, okay, but how can we start to reframe some of these things? So like if it is dragging the kids up in the morning, like could we make a game of that? Could we start to make that a little bit more fun? It's easier said than done when you're half asleep yourself, but how can you start to look at maybe some of these things and make them more fun? I think that's really interesting. Another point that made me think of as well is that I've recently been trying to be a lot more present, particularly with my kids, because I've been just so wrapped up in lots of things, and I feel that I'm kind of there, but maybe not there some of the time. And I really want to be more conscious and more present and enjoy the here and now with them, which is definitely helping. But your model, Savor, which I really, really liked in the book as well, the R in Savor is for reminiscing. And that's talking about the fact that, yes, we need to be mindful in the moment and enjoy the moment, but actually to then enjoy it after it's happened as well. And I thought that's such a great point, because I think it's great and it's very important to be present in here and now. But if you've had like a really good time with your kids or with friends or whatever it is, actually just reminiscing on that afterwards as well and being like, wasn't that such a good day? Or wasn't it great? I was so present and active, and we had such a good time. I think that's a really nice build on that too.
Yeah, and I mean the underarching way to reminisce there, just if anyone's interested, and it's not my idea, it's dispositional gratitude, which I think really allows that to work well. And so dispositional gratitude has three components. It's one, being grateful for those small pleasures and also the connection that we have, right? Because I think one of the things that we get kind of wrapped up in is happiness is really an introspection of the self, right? Because it does require you to compare yourself to the external world, right? Like, where am I with regards to the status of whatever domain you're kind of thinking about, right? Like, well, am I happy, because I have a good job compared to my peers, right? Am I happy? My kids are thriving in context to how they are in school. But when we use dispositional gratitude, it's like that time I had with my kids outside of the external environment, which is so great. Like, I just love that. Like, that little joke that we had, or, the game that we played. So it makes you realize that you're not just on an island, right? That this connection that we have, either to nature, spirituality, or the ones we love, is really what's important, not this status games, of the external environment. The idea that those things are simple, like going out to play with your kids in the yard. We just got a puppy, right? Like, I can do that whenever, right? So what a simple pleasure that brought so much joy into my life. And the fact that it's abundant, right? Because one of the problems, especially with modern society, is it's absolutely true. There's an abundance of nonsense happening all the time, right? Especially here in North America and the current climate. Everyone, no matter what side of the aisle you're at, is getting bombarded with just real crap all the time, right? So it's true, there's an abundance of really bad, unfun stuff. But the truth is, there's still an abundance of really fun stuff that we can attract if we so desire, right? And it doesn't mean that we can't be mindful or empathetic that a lot of really bad stuff is happening, but it does mean that our days don't need to be filled with it. We don't need to doom scroll, 2 hours every night. Maybe you need that for 30 minutes so that you can feel like you're up to date just for your own sanity, but then use the other 90 to fill up your fun cup, to remind yourself that, yeah, this exists, but so does, love and fun and connection and all these things I have access to.
Michael, what's one important thing relating to fun? And we've covered a lot today, but what's one thing that we haven't spoken about that we really should have done?
I mean, I think we've touched on it, but it really is this idea of how important it is, right? That so many of us discount it. And I think to boil it down to its essence, in the spirit of the question, is that these aren't things that are self-serving. They're not acts of whimsy. They're not, necessarily something that you do after the work is done. That, because of the philosophy of hedonism and stuff like that, we tend to think that if we're enjoying ourselves, that somehow we're devaluing our self-worth, and quite the contrary, right? It needs a desperate reframing, because we know that a lot of these consequences that are happening, whether it's loneliness, whether it's burnout from work, whether it's just not the drive, to be able to do the things in the way that we want to serve others, that a big component of that is the fact that we just don't enjoy what we do. And so making things more fun will solve a lot of those ills, and it's just not well understood. And so my hope is that by having these conversations, we begin to solve that.
Michael, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a fabulous conversation. And I think one of the big things that I'm going to take away is actually that final point that you made there around the fact that it's not just self-serving to have fun. It's actually going to have positive repercussions for everyone around us. And if we can start to reframe things like fun as not being something that's just for children or something for someone that's got more time than us, but it is a fundamental building block of a happier, more fulfilling life, then I think that we can really start to look at it and be a lot more deliberate in what we're doing, and ultimately just kind of enjoy what we're doing more, whether it's adding more fun habits into our life, or as you were alluding to, just looking at some of the things that we're doing already and looking at how we can just make them a little bit more fun, because ultimately, why are we all here? To ultimately to have a good life and enjoy ourselves, right? Like when you kind of strip everything back. And I think that we've maybe lost some of that in this hustle culture. So as you were saying, I think conversations like this are really important, just to remind us of really what's important in life, and that's ultimately to have a good time and have some fun. So and I've really had fun and enjoyed this conversation, so thank you very much.
Yeah, take care. Thanks for having me.